It's a privilege to be able to share with you. I'm really excited with this opportunity. I'm going to share my screen, so you don't have to look at me. You can look at some pictures instead, which is far more interesting. And we'll kind of take it from there. There we go. So I even remember to spell center the North American way. So here we go. Keeping God at the center, a framework for following Jesus and caring for God's creation. That's what we're going to try and look at this evening. And looking at different ways in which Christians and others have seen our relationship with the created world that we live in. And really answering this question, this key question really, who is the world for? And one of the ways in which people have answered that through history, and certainly quite often in Christian circles, has been what we call an anthropocentric way of answering that question, saying that nature is really there for people. And the kind of Christian spin on that is that God made it for us, God gave it to us, and so on. And so this image here obviously shows a sort of a hierarchy, a pyramid with humanity at the top there. You might notice that there's a gender hierarchy in that pyramid as well. Those often seem to follow each other. If you have an anthropocentric view, you often have a gender hierarchical view as well. Not inevitable, but it often seems to go like that. As I say, this is often the view that Christians are assumed to have, and particularly over the last 50, 60 years, since a rather famous article written by an American scientific historian called Lynn White Jr. This was published in the journal Science, and it became and still is one of the most cited academic articles of any kind in history. And in that article, Lynn White accused Western Christianity of being the most anthropocentric religion the world has seen. He basically took us back to Genesis and said Genesis teaches a hierarchy. It teaches that God gives humans dominion over nature, that God puts humans above nature, makes us separate from it. And by making humans in God's image, it also separates us completely from the natural world. And the way in which the contemporary ecological crisis has unrolled over the last 100, 200 years, Lynn White would say is down to Christian thinking. It's basically this Christian idea that puts humanity as separate from and above nature that is responsible for the historical roots of our ecologic crisis, as he put it. And that article, right or wrong, has been so often quoted that it has become just assumed to be true by many people. So if you study ecological science, if you study wildlife conservation, in almost any university in the world, you will probably hear Lynn White quoted and cited as if this is gospel, as if this is just what Christians believe and how Christians behave. Now, Lynn White actually had a point. He may have been wrong in some ways, but you can look through Christian history and you can find plenty of examples of famous Christians who have said some fairly dramatic things about humanity being above nature and separate from it. So just a couple of quotes here. John Calvin, the great Swiss reformer, said, "The end for which all things were created was that none of the convenience and necessities of life might be wanting to men." And the early church father, Origen, said, "The Creator then has made everything to serve the natural being and his natural intelligence." So both of them saying quite clearly and straightforwardly, it's all for humanity. God made the world for us. Big question is that what the Bible really teaches? And we're going to dig into that a little bit more this evening. But first, kind of back to Lynn White and back to what he says about Christianity. The fact is, did John Calvin and did Origen get their thinking primarily from the Bible, or did they get it from other sources? And if this is very, very kind of sketchy version of the history here, but if you trace things back, it actually goes probably far more to Greek philosophy and the impact of Greek philosophy on Western Christian thinking than it does to the Bible. It was Greek philosophers such as Aristotle, and also Plato for that matter, who followed something called the great chain of being. And that's a kind of diagram of it on the left there. The idea that there's this hierarchy from being, which is God, ultimate being at the top, and then spiritual beings, angels and demons, and then physical beings, man, woman, notice that hierarchy again, animals, and then the realm of becoming, things that are not fully beings, plants and minerals and non-being. So you may have heard of Thomas Aquinas, a famous Roman Catholic writer and thinker of the Middle Ages. He followed this idea in outlining the idea that we as human beings have spiritual souls, but he talked about other animals having material souls, and even plants and trees about having vegetable souls. And it was this same idea of the hierarchy. But guess what? The great chain of being, that triangle that I showed in the earlier picture, none of those actually come from the Christian scriptures. They're a lens through which the Bible was read and interpreted because of the pervasive influence of Greek philosophy on Western Christian thinking through those early centuries, and actually right through probably until the Enlightenment and beyond. And we see the impact of that, not just in Christianity, but actually just as much within secular Western thinking. So if we look at the global conservation movement, the global environmental movement today, we see exactly the same thing. So you may have heard of ecosystem services. It's a phrase that's thrown around a lot by the United Nations, by many, many other groups, and seen very, very positively. But what ecosystem services are is simply what nature does for us as human beings. Food and the other things it provides, the energy it gives us, the conditions that make life possible for human beings. Ecosystem services assumes that the earth is there for us. And another phrase that we use all the time, natural resources, suggests effectively that nature is simply resources for us, for human beings. And today it's become increasingly popular in many parts of the conservation world to talk about monetizing nature, putting a value in terms of billions or trillions of dollars on what nature does for us. Hence that picture of a forest that is also a barcode. So this kind of anthropocentric view, this idea that the world is there primarily to serve humanity, it's there for our needs, our wants, our desires, is actually incredibly pervasive. It's not just there within Christianity. You find it in many parts of the world and in many cultures. And certainly in the West, you find its roots go right back to Greek philosophy. But of course, it's not the only way of looking at things. So let's move on, secondly, to another way of answering that question, who is the world for? And here we have a different picture. We have a circle in which you just kind of see randomly scattered around all sorts of creatures. Male and female humans are there, but so are whales and starfish and amoeba and sharks and dogs and all sorts of other things too. And the idea is that no part is more valuable than any other part. It all has intrinsic value. And this is ecocentrism. It's basically the idea that nature matters in and for itself, in and of itself, you could say. That what matters is the whole, and that we as humans must be careful that we don't disturb the ecological balance of the rest of nature, because all of it is valuable. And what right have we to destroy the habitats, the lives of other creatures? We are just one creature amongst the many. And ecocentrism takes various forms. One perhaps slightly extreme version of it came in a famous book that was written a few years ago by Ed Wilson, E.O. Wilson, one of the most famous scientists of the 20th and early 21st century. And he wrote a book called Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life. in which he argued that the only way we're going to save the natural world is basically by keeping humans out. And he came up with this very serious suggestion, and many others have taken it further and trying to work out what it looks like, saying that we basically need half the oceans, half the land surface of the earth that humans completely keep away from. And that's the only way nature's going to thrive, because wherever humans go, they mess it up. They pollute it, they destroy it. Keeping humans out is the only way to protect nature. And although there probably aren't that many at the government level who would agree with the half-Earth theory, it's interesting that at the last global conservation COP, you'll know that there are climate COPs, big conferences, but there's also a conservation COP that happens, a biodiversity COP that happens every 3 or 4 years. And at the last one, its aim was what it calls 30 by 30, that 30% of the world's surface of the land and the oceans should be dedicated to nature by 2030. So in a sense, E.O. Wilson won the argument, even if not the percentages. Now, I wonder if anyone here knows where this photo was taken. I have to say, I didn't actually take the photo myself. I found it online. I'm not going to ask you all to give your answers. You might be able to imagine, think, where might that be? Well, I'm going to tell you. Here comes the answer. This is what's known as the DMZ, the Demilitarized Zone on the Korean Peninsula. It's what separates North Korea and South Korea, and has done ever since the end of the Korean War. It's become the most important reserve for biodiversity on the Korean Peninsula. Why? Because humans have kept out. Because this stretch of land, nowhere wider than 10 or 20 kilometers, but going right across the Korean Peninsula, has had almost no human activity in it, apart from people pointing guns across it, but almost no human activity in it over the last 70 years. And because of that, species that have been driven to extinction or near extinction in many other parts of the Korean Peninsula are able to thrive within that area. So again, it's some evidence that this kind of ecocentric view, the E.O. Wilson's view, actually has some basis to it. So you've got various views here. You've got the kind of the extreme at the bottom of the upside down pyramid here, the egocentric, that it's all there for me. You've got the anthropocentric, what Lynn White accused us of having, saying it's all there for humanity. You've got what's sometimes called a biocentric view, that all living beings have an equal right to the planet. And then you've got kind of the ultimate ecocentric view, that the Earth itself, the whole planet, the biosphere, if you prefer, is valuable in and of itself. And so our question that we're going to dig into for the rest of this time here is, what does the Bible actually say, and how does that affect how we should live? I'm just going to go through a small selection of passages. Inevitably, I'm kind of simplifying a bit because of the time that we've got together. I want to start with the obvious one, with Genesis, because Lynn White has made so much of that, and ask, what does it really actually say? Particularly those key verses in Genesis 1, 26 through 28. Humans as the crown of creation, humans as made in God's image, humans as given dominion, humans as told to fill and subdue the earth. It's a pretty strong case for anthropocentrism, you might think. But is it actually all that it seems? Let's look at those quickly one by one. Firstly, crown of creation. Actually, that's not a phrase the Bible ever uses of human beings. It's a phrase that has become into Christian thinking. And many theologians today would argue that if you read the creation narratives in Genesis 1 and 2 carefully, the crown of creation is not actually human beings. We, after all, are actually created on the same day as all the other mammals. We're not given a day to ourselves. The crown of creation is actually day 7, which is God enjoying all that he made and calls very good. It's the Sabbath. God's rest and enjoyment of the whole of creation is actually the crown of it all. Secondly, We are made in God's image. But what does that mean? Is that something that sets us apart from and above the rest of nature? Well, probably more has been written on that phrase than any other phrase in the Bible. But very little of it has actually been based on the context of the actual text of Genesis 1. If you read Genesis 1, it's actually pretty straightforward. God makes us in his image, male and female, so that we might rule over the beasts of the field, the birds of the air, and the fish of the sea. In other words, nature conservation is integral to being made in God's image. This is a job description. It's not a title, it's a vocation. And in Genesis 2:15, where God puts the first man in the garden, Adam is placed in Eden to do what? To tend and keep, to serve and preserve the garden of creation. So I, along with many others, would argue that being made in God's image is a vocation to serve and preserve. Now, you might be thinking, but what about that word dominion? Surely that means that we are kings over creation, that we are allowed to dominate it. Dominion, domination, they sound very similar. Well, what does dominion actually mean? Well, the Hebrew word for dominion is radah, and it is a royal term. But what's the biblical understanding of kingship? Remember that in the Old Testament, God's people didn't have kings initially. All the other nations had kings or emperors. God's people just had judges. But then God's people kept saying to Samuel the prophet, we want kings. We want to be like all the other nations. Samuel and God tried to argue them out of it. Said, are you sure you want kings? Look what kings do. Look how they behave. They overtax you. They exploit you. They send you to war. They just treat you as their playthings. But the people kept saying, we want kings. And God allowed them to have kings. But God said, your kings must not be as the kings of the nations. They must be, well, in the New Testament, we would call it servant kings. That's the ultimate model in Jesus. In the Old Testament, the imagery that's nearly always used is that of a shepherd and the sheep. Kings are to be good shepherds of their sheep. So dominion, if we are to have dominion over our fellow creatures, we are to be good shepherds. This is not about domination. This is not about exploitation. This is about being prepared to lay down our lives for the welfare of other creatures. That's the biblical understanding of dominion. Finally, we're told to fill and subdue the earth. I'm not going to spend much time on fill, because that was, of course, said at a time when there were only 2 human beings on the planet. If we were ever going to have that godly dominion, we were going to have to multiply and spread out over the face of the earth. But right from literally the 2nd century AD, Christian leaders have said, we've already done that bit, filling the earth. We don't need to carry on having a population explosion. What we need to do is learn how to subdue it properly. And that word subdue sounds like a very strong word. It is a strong word. It's the Hebrew word kabas. And it means to bring under control. And it's predominantly an agricultural word. If you're a farmer and you find a piece of land, maybe you inherit it, and that land is pretty uneven, it's covered in rocks, it's got all kinds of weeds growing in it, you're going to have to bring that land under control. You're going to have to subdue it if it's going to be fruitful. So it's about active management, active participation in shaping creation, but it's not about, if you like, just trying to take from it whatever we want in a selfish way. So Genesis 1 is actually much more subtle in what it means than we've often assumed in the past. And you might think, well, surely, Dave, you're over-egging it slightly by just talking about those verses and reinterpreting them. But actually, no, because if you look at Genesis 1 in comparison with the rest of Scripture, what I'm saying becomes even more clear. So let's, for example, compare Genesis 1 to the book of Job, which is one of the other places in the Bible that actually it's a much longer passage about creation. Job 38 right through to 41. You've got 4 chapters there that are solidly about nature and about God's place in creation and our place in creation. And God says to us in Job 38, well, he says to Job, and by implication to us, were you there when I laid the earth's foundations? Later on, who cuts a channel for the torrents of rain and a patch for the thunderstorm, to water a land where no man lives, desert with no one in it, to satisfy a desolate wasteland and make it sprout with grass? And God is kind of teasing us, teasing human beings, teasing Job in that passage. And notice what he says here. He's saying that he cares for and waters places where no human being lives, places that we see as desolate wastelands, because he's caring for the creatures that live there completely independently of us. In other words, it's not all for us. It's not about us. In Job, there's a profound reorientation to say that the natural world does not exist for us. And it's not just Job. Read Psalm 104. We've not time to do that this evening, but it's the longest nature poem in any ancient literature. And it's all about God's care for every part of the created world. The nighttime belongs to the young lions. The mountaintops belong to the wild goats. The treetops belong to the birds. And then when the lions go to bed, God allows the humans to go out and do their bits of agriculture. And God cares for all of them, all these different parts. It really is not an anthropocentric view that we find in Job, in the Psalms, or when we look carefully enough in Genesis. Then we can look through the rest of the Bible, and I'm going to skip through this really, really rapidly because of time. But the story of Noah is a really important story for us here. It's the first explicit covenant that God makes after sin and the fall have affected the whole created order. And just who does God have a covenant with? He has a covenant with every living creature on earth. It's repeated 7 times in the Hebrew text of Genesis 9. God's covenant includes non-human creatures. Even in one verse, it's my covenant with the earth. Surely that's a bit more ecocentric. We often think about it. And just look at the math, look at the numbers. Who was on the ark? How many human beings? Well, we're told about 4 pairs of human beings, Noah and his 3 sons and all of their wives, and 7 pairs of most creatures, even 1 pair of those that were unclean, that were totally useless to Noah. Couldn't eat them, couldn't even touch them. They were unclean, but God wanted them on the ark. Why? Because they mattered to God. Genesis says, so that their kind might continue upon the earth. So again, there's this kind of decentering of the idea that it's all about us. God seems to be particularly interested in biodiversity conservation. And let's move to the New Testament now. What about Jesus? Surely Jesus came to save us and save our souls. Yes, he did. But there's a bigger framing of that. Have a look at passages like Colossians 1, or even the most famous verse in the New Testament, John 3:16. God so loved the what? God so loved the world. I remember the shock when I was studying New Testament Greek at Bible college and came across that verse and discovered that the Greek word was cosmos. God so loved the cosmos that he sent his only son. And I remember asking my lecturers and looking up all the commentaries. And to my shock, I discovered that cosmos meant the same in New Testament Greek and classical Greek, pretty much the same as it means today. Its normal everyday meaning was the whole created order. And in Colossians, Paul explains just why that's the case. Colossians 1 talks about Jesus as the one by whom and for whom all things were made. Well, that blows apart anthropocentrism. It wasn't made for us. It was made for Jesus, by and for him. And then Colossians 1 goes on to say all things hold together in him. He's the sustainer. And then in verses 19 and 20, it completes it by saying, through Jesus' death on the cross, all things in heaven and on earth are reconciled to God. So Jesus came to save not just me and you, he came to save all things in heaven and on earth. That's what Paul says. It's there in the Bible. Jesus is much bigger than we often think. So going back to those images, we had the anthropocentric, or if you prefer, egocentric. We had the ecocentric, but I want to suggest that the Bible actually teaches a theocentric view. This world was not made for us, nor does this world get its value just by being itself, that everything has equal and identical value. Rather, the value of every part of the created world comes from God. Our value, but the value of, just looking at the picture there, pigs and whales and frogs and jellyfish and cows and dogs, and everything else. It all comes from God. So answering the question that we had at the beginning about who is the world for, the answer is it's for God. As Psalm 24 puts it, the earth is the Lord's and all that is in it. And as Christians, we can specifically say it's for Jesus. Things were made by him and for him. And you might be thinking, okay, that picture there, it's obviously a heart. God so loved the world. Okay, that's fair enough. Why are human beings at the bottom? Isn't that placing us right there underneath everything else, as if we're meant to be the kind of slaves to the rest of creation? Well, it's actually more subtle than that. In ecology, there's this idea of a keystone species, a species on which a whole ecosystem depends. And if you remove that keystone species, the ecosystem collapses. And I would argue that God has made us as a keystone species within creation. He has put a lot of responsibility on our shoulders, for good or for bad. He has made us in his image and called us to care for his creation. He has said he wants us to partner with him to be creation's guardians, stewards, caretakers. Nature exists not for us, but for God. That's what theocentrism says. Now, I'm not the only person saying this. I've been saying this for quite a long time. I wrote a paper back in, I've just jumped a slide there. Wrote a paper back in 2014, which argued for this. Biblical witness is profoundly theocentric, putting both humanity and biodiversity within the orbit of God's wider purposes and plans. And just a few years ago, a couple of people who you may know, Ben Lowe and Rachel Lamb, who's chair of the A Rocha US board, along with another good friend of ours, Ruth Padilla de Bost from Costa Rica, co-wrote a paper talking about a theocentric approach to conservation and development, recognizing that we need to have that theocentric, that God-centered approach. And I argued exactly the same in my PhD thesis. What God values most is not the thriving of one species, but the flourishing of the whole creation together within a theocentric universe. And I had to invent a new word in that thesis to kind of explain what I meant, because I realized that people could claim to be theocentric, say, well, it's all made for God, but God's given it all to us, and therefore we can do what we like with it. Actually, that's a real twisting of the biblical text. So I coined this word theo-ecocentric. It's all made for God, but what God wants is for us to help all of creation to thrive. Our role is to be the caretakers, to be the stewards, to be the guardians, guardians of the galaxy, if you like. Well, no, maybe not guardians of the galaxy, but guardians of the earth, at least, to help all of it to thrive together. So, ecocentrism, people within nature, keeping God at the center. And I just want to finish off the time that we've got before we throw it open for discussion by looking at a few values that come from this that kind of make a difference to us practically. And I've tried to make them all start with the letter W. Let's see if this works. Firstly, our worldview. And we may need to change the way we think about our place. We need to firstly recognize we are part of nature. We breathe, we eat, we're born, we die. We are part of nature. We cannot exist outside this earth. That's how God made us. We are creatures. Yes, we're made in the image of God, but we're also creatures. We need to recognize our dependence and interdependence. So that's the worldview bit. And there are other bits that follow from that as well. Now, I don't want to get into contemporary US politics. It's rather a kind of hot topic at the moment. But if you go back into the history of conservation in North America, this discussion between kind of a more anthropocentric, a more ecocentric approach has been there right from the very start. Back from when the national parks movement began, John Muir, who is the great kind of advocate of conservation, he had a kind of more ecocentric view. Preserve unimpaired the natural and cultural resources and values of the national park system. That was his view. And his great rival in terms of view at the time was a guy called Gifford Pinchot from the Forest Service. And he talked about land management to meet the diverse needs of present and future generations. In other words, he was talking about using nature to serve people, whereas or anthropocentric view, whereas John Muir was saying, no, nature has values and resources of its own, which we should preserve unimpaired. It's a much more ecocentric view. What's interesting is both Pinchot and Muir were actually Christians. And both of them believed they were getting their views from the Bible. But to some extent, I think they were both mistaken, because both of them kind of took God out of the equation when it came down to the practicalities. Nature's value lies with God, not with itself, and not with what it's useful for us for. Moving on from worldview, something very practical, wonder. We are called to take delight in nature, recognizing we're connected to it, we're part of it, and it's suffused, it's breathed through by God. God's Spirit is at work in nature. We see the fingerprints of Jesus, who handcrafted this world, in the world around us. All children have an innate sense of wonder. And just as you see this European kingfisher, which had just been ringed, you can see or I think banded if you're in North America, you can see the little band on its leg, and then you can see it being released. That sense of connection, that sense of wonder at the natural world is something we're all called to take part in. So rediscovering a sense of wonder. And then worship. Caring for creation is part of our worship. In Romans 8, Paul says these words: the creation waits with eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. Who are the children of God? The church. Creation is waiting for the church. That's what Paul's arguing in Romans 8. And therefore, caring for creation should be an integral part of what churches are doing. Of course, it's not the whole picture, but it's part of what we're called to do and be, which is why it's wonderful that you are part of this cohort and working with A Rocha US as churches. And then our witness. As you heard, one of my roles is working with the Lausanne movement on creation care. And back in 2010, the Lausanne movement released an important document called the Cape Town Commitment, which includes these words: The gospel is God's good news through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ for three groups: individual persons, and for society, and for creation. All three must be part of the comprehensive mission of God's people. So creation care is part of our witness. It's part of our mission. And what we've found in A Rocha's work right around the world is that when Christians take the earth seriously, people take the gospel seriously. It actually makes Jesus more attractive when we care for creation well as Christians. Next, wisdom. There's a lot in the Bible about the connections between wisdom and creation. If you read about King Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived, a lot of his wisdom consisted actually in nature study. There's a whole bit about that in the Bible. But in Psalm 104, it says, "In wisdom you made them all. The earth is filled with all of your creatures." And so we need to learn from nature. Now, this is really important. We're obviously facing a huge global ecological crisis at the moment. We're facing extreme weather events. We're losing biodiversity left, right, and center. We're seeing a crisis with the climate, with pollution, so many other areas. How do we solve that? Well, there are some people who think that technical solutions are going to get us all the way, that we can kind of, soak up all the oxygen by carbon capture and storage, all the carbon dioxide by carbon capture and storage. There are others who think that there are all sorts of high-tech ways in which we can deal with the problems. Now, I'm certainly not anti-technology, but surely what we need to do first is look at how nature looks after itself and how it restores itself. And in A Rocha International, we strongly promote what we call nature-based solutions to the climate and biodiversity crisis. That nature actually, God has put into nature an incredible resilience, an incredible ability to heal itself if we allow it to do so in the right way. It's not coincidence that Jesus told us to look at the birds and look at the flowers. We get wisdom when we study nature carefully. And then our work. I wonder if you see conservation as a vocation, as a Christian calling, because I believe we need to do that. We're really good at making a fuss in our churches of missionaries and pastors and those who go into what we call full-time ministry. In some churches, we're good at making a fuss of teachers and of healthcare workers, doctors and nurses and firefighters, and people who make a real difference. But what about conservationists? What about scientists? Do we recognize that these are God-given callings and vocations that we need to recognize, we need to pray for, and we need to support in our churches? And in our work, whatever kind of work you're involved in, and I'm sure we've got people in all kinds of different workplaces this evening, we need to recognize that the way in which all of our societies view this has become rather topsy-turvy, because at the moment it seems like everything has to serve the economy. But actually, if you look at the biblical picture, the economy and human society are kind of subsets within nature. We cannot have successful societies, and we cannot long-term have a successful economy without resilient and thriving ecosystems. And so to have policies that chop down ancient forests, that drill in the Arctic. I'm sorry if I'm getting a little bit political here, but I'm not American, so maybe I can say this. Those things actually go right against what the Bible teaches about what matters most here, because the economy is not what matters most. Our thriving as human beings and the thriving of the whole creation, which exists to glorify God, actually matter more. The economy is simply there to serve. Final slide. I had to put this one in. A Rocha, as you know, A Rocha in the US is part of a worldwide family. of A Rocha organizations right around the world. And it's my privilege to be part of A Rocha International, which helps serve those national organizations. And what we see through A Rocha's work all around the world in really different contexts, in different cultures, is a phrase that I've grown to love, which I think Peter Harris, the founder of A Rocha, came up with originally, which is what we're doing is writing the gospel in the landscape. We're trying to demonstrate in practical ways the good news of Jesus, whether it's caring for elephants in India, whether it's caring for seabirds in New Zealand, whether it's caring for wetlands in Lebanon, whether it's growing urban food in London. Whatever we're doing, we're trying to write the gospel in the landscape and so witness to Jesus.